Hey there, folks. It's Blue here at Blue Bears Games. Last week, I said I didn't know what I would have for you this week, but a customer came through and ordered a custom budget commander deck, so that's what's on the docket for today. The order was for a Renata Called to the Hunt commander deck with the obvious choice of a +1/+1 counter theme. Why should it be obvious, you ask? Well, let's talk about Renata. She is a 4-mana, star 3 legendary enchantment demigod, where her power is equal to your devotion to green, and a second ability that states that each other creature you control enters play with an additional +1/+1 counter. The additional counters ability of Renata is why it should be obvious, and believe me, does this build produce a lot of them. The counter scheme makes this a simple combat-based deck, but I did add some fun stuff to go with it to make it a little bit more complex. So let's just jump right in, and I'll show you what I came up with on a $40 budget. Oh, and get ready for the phrase +1/+1 counter a lot. So the land base is pretty simple. It's mostly utility, and then the basics. So I start off with a Colony Garden. It enters tapped, but it does enter with a 1/1 token that can be buffed by the Renata ability, and then it taps to add green, so it's not completely useless, but it's pretty good, actually. I wanted to put in as much card draw or get rid of the excess land type of stuff as I could, so I did all three of the currently available cycling lands for green. So Tranquil Thicket cycles for 1 green, Slippery Karsh cycles for 2 colorless, and Desert of the Indomitable cycles for a green and a colorless. And I wanted to do that so that I could get better draws later, and also to get more cards in my hand and get rid of the bad stuff, because excess lands later on in the game don't really help. Ash Barrens is the last one that finishes out the cycling cycle, but this one goes and gets a basic land instead of let you draw a card, which is useful because it actually gets a land out of your deck and puts it in your hand at least, so you don't have to draw that later. Cave of Temptation, so it comes into play untapped, which is great. Taps to add a colorless, which, you know, in a monocolored deck, it's not as important to have all lands tapped for the color. You can also pay 1 and tap it to add a mana of any color, but that's not going to be useful. It's the last ability, which is to pay 4, tap, and sack it to give 2 +1/+1 counters to target creature. That's why this is in here, because the theme of this deck is 100%, unequivocally, +1/+1 counters. Field of Ruin, because if you've seen enough of my videos, you know I put at least 1 land destruction land, or at least something that destroys a land in a deck. This is what I have left as far as my stuff goes. I ran out of all the other ones, so if anybody has any extras, I wouldn't mind you sending them to me. It enters play untapped, taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 2, tap and sack it to destroy a non-basic land, and that opponent then that an opponent controls, and then each player searches their library for a basic land card and puts it on the battlefield. So it at least replaces it for you. Unfortunately, it replaces it for your opponent, and apparently every opponent. So it's not the greatest, but it's what I had. Myriad Landscape, it enters tapped, taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 2, tap and sack it to go search for 2 basic land cards that share a land type and put them on the battlefield tapped. And this deck is going to mostly be forests. It's going to be a good amount of them, so that's actually pretty good. Evolving Wilds, and of course Terramorphic Expanse, again for deck thinning and getting lands out of your library and into play. And then again, I said it just a second ago, lots of farce. I don't remember how many, I think it's 25 or something like that, but it's quite a lot. So if you want to see how many it was, the deck list will be available in the description. The ramp section for this deck is actually going to be a mixed bag of things. We're in green and mono green, so there are a lot of different ways that you can go get land and put into play. So I'll show you what I've chosen for the budget build here. Rampant Growth goes and gets a basic land, puts it into play, tapped. Map the Wastes, it goes and gets a land and puts it into play for 3, but then it also bolsters, which is to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, which fits this deck very well. Natural Connection, it's an instant version that for 3 that goes and gets a basic land and puts it into play. Vastwood Surge is a 4-cast sorcery with kicker of 4, so it can be 8 total if you want it to be. You search your library for up to 2 lands that are basic, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then if it was kicked, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, which again fits this very well. New Horizons, like I said, it's going to be a mixed bag. I have a couple of things here that are not just spells. It's a 30-cast enchantment. It enchants a land, and when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then the land has the ability to tap for 2 mana of any one color. Same thing with this, with Granted Growth, it's 3 cast and enchants a land. When it comes into play, put a counter on a creature or a vehicle you control, which there are no vehicles in here. And then the enchanted land again has tap to add 2 mana of any one color. Fertilid, like I said, mixed bag. 3 cast 0/0 creature that enters play with 2 +1/+1 counters. So really good with Renata, because now it'll enter with an additional one. And there are other things that I had that'll go with Fertilid that'll actually be nice and synergistic. And then you can pay 2 to remove one of those counters from it. Search your library for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped. And then shuffle naturally. Rishkar, so another creature, 3 cast 2/2. When it enters play, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 creatures, and then each creature you control with a counter on it will have tap to add a green. This deck will 100% be all about +1/+1 counters, so all of your creatures at some point should be able to tap to add mana if Rishkar is on the field. Kami of the Whispered Hopes is a 3 cast 1/1. This one's actually very synergistic with this deck because it does both ramp and adds counters to everything. So if one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on a permanent you control, that many +1 are put on it instead, and then it can tap to add X mana of any one color, where X is Kami of the Whispered Hope's power. So as it gets bigger, it starts to add more mana. As far as the creatures go, this is going to be a huge section because it's mono green, so mostly it's going to be creatures anyway. But the amount of creatures that can fit into a +1/+1 counter themed deck are actually quite vast. We'll start off with Iron Apprentice. It's a 1-cast artifact creature. It enters play with a +1/+1 counter, and then when it dies, it can actually move its counters to something else. So it's great for things, especially if it has something where it says if you place a +1/+1 counter on something, because when you move, it's actually placing them, so that counts to trigger those as well. So keep that in mind for a lot of other cards. Contortionist Trope. It's a 1 green and X card. Enters with the amount of counters that you put into X. And then it has Coven, which is at the beginning of your end step. If you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. You'll have so many counters moving around that you will probably have more than 3 creatures with different powers. Feral Hydra, another 1 green and X, enters with X +1/+1 counters, and then for each 3 put into it. And I say put into it, not you, because actually anybody can do this. You can put a +1/+1 counter on it. Wildwood Scourge, another 1 green and X, enters with X +1/+1 counters. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put onto another non-Hydra creature that you control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Vastwood Hydra. So when other things get the counters, that if they're not a Hydra, so does this. A lot of counters going on around here. Lesser Masticore, it's a 2-cast 2/2 that when you cast it, you have to discard a card. But for each 4 you put into it, you can deal 1 damage to a creature, so it's good removal for all that excess mana that you may have. But it has Persist, and Persist says that when it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter. This is actually a part of an infinite loop that you can create. The extra part on that is part of the infinite loop is not in here because it actually has a monetary value higher than the deck. But if you do, let me explain how it works. If you have a -1/-1 counter and a +1/+1 counter put on the same object, they cancel each other out and fall off. So when Renata is out and Lesser Masticore dies, it'll come back to play with both the -1/-1 and +1/+1 counter falling off, and it'll just be the 2/2, and nothing happens. So if it dies again, it can come back again. So if you use something like an Ashnod's Altar or a Phyrexian Altar, you can infinitely loop for infinite mana. Or if you do the, I can't remember the name of it, but the artifact that you can sacrifice a creature for free, and then you have target player mill cards, you can actually do that infinitely, and then you have your infinite loop. Gnarlid Colony, 2-cast 2/2, has a kicker of 3. If you kicked it, it comes in play with 2 counters, and then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample. And everything in this deck should have a counter on it, so every creature should have Trample, and there's a synergy with that later too. Obsessive Skinner, 2-cast 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you can put a counter on a creature, on a target creature. It doesn't have to be one you control. Don't know why you would put it on somebody else's. Has Delirium that at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that's pretty important. If there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This deck has enough different types of cards that it should actually work. You should be able to get that extra counter. Nessian Horn Beetle, 2-cast 2/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And the amount of counters, again, should make it so that you have creatures with power 4 or greater. Null Hunter, 2-cast 2/2, has Pack Tactics. Whenever it attacks, if you attacked with creatures with total power 6 or greater, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Duskshell Crawler, 2-cast 0/3. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, target creature. And then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample. I tried to get as many instances of being able to give Trample as possible because your creatures are going to be big, and that's your evasion for this deck. Crunch Wrangler, 2-cast 2/1 Trampler, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it grows as your guys come out. Whirling Dervish was an interesting choice. I found this in my stuff, and I was like, oh, I want to try this. So it's a 2-cast 1/1 that has protection from black, which means that it can't be damaged by anything that's black. It can't be enchanted. It can't be equipped. It can't be blocked, and it can't be targeted by black things. That's what protection means. Just remember DEBT or debt. That's what protection means. But when it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it at the end of each turn, which it damages an opponent. And that's key here because it doesn't actually have to be attacking. It could be a way that, I don't have it in here, but if you give it an equipment that lets it tap to do damages to an opponent, you can put the +1/+1 counters on it for that. Avatar of the Resolute, 2-cast 3/2, reach Trample. That's all good right there. That's actually very good for 2 mana. However, it also has, when it enters the battlefield, with a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So it could be really large for 2 green. It could be huge. It also can block flying creatures and has evasion with Trample. So that guy is a superstar in this deck. Skyclave Sentinel, 3-cast 2/2 with a kicker of 4, has Flying and Defender. However, if it has a +1/+1 counter on it, it loses Defender.
Or actually, it doesn't lose Defender. It can attack as if though it didn't have Defender. And then if you kicked it, it comes into play with 2+1/+1 counters. The reason why this is actually better than you think is because with Renata out, it's a 3 to cast 3/4 flyer that can attack as if though it didn't have Defender. So that's a pretty good stat base for 3. Diamond Knight, 3 to cast 1/1 with Vigilance, and when it enters play, you choose a color, and then whenever you cast a spell of the chosen color, you put a counter on it. And that means it could get really big really quickly. Deepwood Denizen, card draw time, 3 to cast 3/2 with Vigilance. You can pay 6 and tap it to draw a card, but this ability costs 1 less to activate for each +1/+1 counter on creatures you control. So when I tested this deck on Arena just for fun, I usually test it with Sparky just to see if there's synergies. I actually got this to the point where it was always just pay 1 green, tap it, and draw a card. It's really good in this style of deck. Pride Malkin, 3 to cast 2/1, enters with a +1/+1 counter. I'm sorry, it enters and you can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, target creature. And each creature you control with that a counter has trample. So again, another instance of being able to give trample because that is the best way you can get evasion in green. Territorial Scythe Cat, 3 to cast 2/1, trample, landfall. Whenever a land comes into play, put a counter on it. Heir of the Ancient Fang, 3 to cast 2/3. When it enters play, put a +1/+1 counter on it. If you control a modified creature, modified creatures are enchanted, equipped, or have a counter on them of some sort. So most likely this will come into play as a 3 to cast 3/4, just like the Skyclave Sentinel. Hornbash Mentor, 3 to cast 3/3. When it enters play, you put a trample counter on target non-human creature you control, and then for 3 and you can tap it, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with trample, and that's one of the reasons why I have so many instances of trample, is because this guy can actually spit out counters if the creatures have trample. Managorger Hydra, 3 to cast 1/1 with trample, and then whenever a player casts a spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And in a 4-player pod, especially if you're playing against a Spell Slinger, this guy can get really big really quickly and get out of hand. Oran Reef Ooze, 3 to cast 2/2. When it enters play, put a counter on a creature you control, and then when it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with one of those counters on it already. So you can see where they're cascading all these +1/+1 counters. All these creatures are going to get really large. They did when I tested it. Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, 3 to cast 0/0 that enters with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. And then whenever another green creature enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on him. And if its power was greater than Yorvo's, you put another +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. So in my testing with this guy, he got really big, but then he got to the point where he was so big that he wasn't getting the additional counter, but he can get there quickly. Tawashi Guidebot, 4 to cast 2/1. When he enters play, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. And then for 4 and tapping it, you can draw a card, and the ability costs 1 less to activate for each modified creature you control. This guy actually got to the point where I could just tap him to draw a card, which is where you want to be. Armorcraft Judge, 4 to cast 3/3. When it enters play, draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. He can draw you a lot. Let's just put it that way. Long Shot Squad, 4 to cast 3/3, has Outlast, which is you can put a +1/+1 counter on it by paying 2, but only as a sorcery. And then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Reach. And that's important because there is no real flying in this deck. There is some anti-flying stuff, but this guy will help make it so that you can actually block a lot more flying. Crowned Ceratok, 4 to cast 4/3 with Trample. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample. Again, another instance of it. Mawu Loyal Companion, 4 to cast 3/3 with Trample and Vigilance. And then if a +1/+1 counter will be put on it, you can put an additional one on it at the same time. So if it was to get a single instance of +1/+1, you put an additional one. If you were to put 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, however many at the same time in the same instance, you only get an additional one. It doesn't actually double, so keep that in mind. Iridescent Hornbeetle. This one's actually interesting for this deck. It actually has the ability to make you go wide and use a lot of Sacrificial Lamb stuff. So Iridescent Hornbeetle is a 5 to cast 3/4 that at the beginning of your end step, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter that you've put on a creature you control this turn. Each counter, that's important. So if you're putting a lot of counters on things, you will get a lot of 1/1s that also will come into play with +1/+1 counters. So this guy can get really nuts really quickly. Hero's Bane, 5 to cast 0/0, enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters. And for each 4 you put into it, you can double the, not double because technically it might not be double, but you can put additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to its power. I want to say double, but there are things out there that will also add an additional, so it's technically not always double. Bellowing Tangleworm is a 5 to cast 4/4 with Intimidate, which is basically the green version of Fear, so it can't be blocked by creatures that are not green or artifacts, but it gives all your other creatures that are green Intimidate as well, which is another form of evasion that this deck has. Ridgescale Tusker, 5 to cast 5/5. When it enters play, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. It's pretty simple. Plague Maul Beast, it's one of the few instances of Proliferate in this deck, and there's a reason for that. It's a 5 to cast 4/3. You can tap it and sacrifice a creature to Proliferate, and this synergizes very well with the Iridescent Hornbeetle. So the scenario is that it will put out a token for you. You sacrifice a token, So you give everything +1/+1 counters, and then you'll actually take that 1 token and turn it into however many creatures you have in play that will have a +1/+1 counter on it. So you can turn, in some instances, 1 token that you've created into possibly 10 or 20. So it's pretty good. Slurk, all ingesting. It's a 6 to cast 0/0. It enters play with 5 +1/+1 counters. And then when it or another creature you control dies, if it had +1/+1 counters on it, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So as you can see, lots of movement of counters. It gets nuts pretty quickly. And the last creature is going to be Walking Skyscraper. It's an 8 to cast, 8/8 Trampler that has basically affinity for modified creatures, so it costs 1 less to cast for each modified creature you control, and it also has hexproof as long as it's untapped. So if you can find a way to give it vigilance, it could always have hexproof, and it's an 8/8 Trampler that will have counters on it, so it's pretty good in this deck. The instants and sorceries of this deck are actually a mixed bag of what I usually do for budget stuff, you know, quasi-card draw and destruction stuff, and then 1 finisher. So Seek the Wilds lets you look at 4 cards on top of your library, reveal a creature or land, put it in your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library. And then the same thing with the Warm Welcome. It's 3 to cast. You look at the top 5 cards of your library, you can reveal just a creature card from among them, put it in your hand, but then you also get to create a 1/1 token, which if Renata's out, gets a +1/+1 counter, so you get a little more go wide. Beast Hunt, 3 to cast, reveal the top 3 cards of your library, and then you can put all creature cards revealed this way into your hand, so you could possibly, the amount of creatures in this deck means that this card could actually hit 3 cards in 1 shot, and it's 4 to cast, not 3. Destruction-wise, Naturalize, destroy an artifact enchantment, Return to Nature, destroys an artifact enchantment, or exiles a card from a graveyard. Carnivorous Canopy, 3 to cast, destroys an artifact enchantment or a creature with flying, but if that permanent that you destroyed was a mana value of 3 or less, you proliferate, which is the other proliferate card in here, so it's a lot of synergy. Crushing Canopy, 3 to cast. You can choose to either destroy a creature with flying or destroy an enchantment. Return to Nature, 4 to cast, destroys an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. As you can see, I wanted to get rid of flying as much as possible. I do that every time I make a mono green deck. This is the same thing I do for all of them. Hunter's Edge is the only fight/bite card in the deck, just because I didn't have enough room for all of it. It's 4 to cast. You put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature that you don't control. I figured that the combat tricks and stuff like that should be enough to get rid of people's creatures. Reclaiming Vines, 4 to cast, destroys an artifact, enchantment, or a land. And then Storm the Seed Core is 4 to cast. You distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among creatures, up to 4 creatures that you control. So you can put 4 on 1, 2 on 2, 3 on 1, and 1 on 1, or 4 ones on up to 4. And then creatures you control will gain vigilance and trample until the turn. This is my... So I wanted to fit the theme of the deck. Usually I put in like an overrun or something like that in here. I wanted to try something new because this gives counters instead of just giving a static buff that is for 1 turn. They stay on the creatures, so I wanted to try something new. The enchantments of this deck are actually really fun. So Roaring Earth is something I found I like a lot lately. It's 2 to cast enchantment that when it has landfall, that whenever a land enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. It has a channel ability to do something where you can discard it to put +1/+1 counters on a creature or on a land, and it becomes a 0/0 creature. But I actually don't care about that. Most of the time when I use this, I want it because it's a landfall effect that puts a counter on something. And a deck like this, it's actually quite good. Fight Rigging, 3 to cast. It has Hideaway 5, which means that you take the top 5 cards of your library. You take one of them and put it face down underneath the Fight Rigging is the easiest thing to do. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and then from there, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then, if you control a creature with power 7 or greater, you may play the exiled card without paying its cost. So it hides something away that you can play later if you meet a requirement. The good thing is that once that happens, it doesn't matter. This is still an enchantment that stays in play that still continues to give +1/+1 counters. Really good for this deck. Master Chef is a 3 to cast legendary enchantment that's a background. We don't have the ability to use a background with Renata because it doesn't have choose a background. But when you get this in play, it gives commander creatures you own have this creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, and other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. Realize that this only comes into play if your commander is on the battlefield, not any other time. So keep that in mind. Curse of Predation, it's a curse, it enchants a player, and then whenever a creature attacks the enchanted player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. That includes your opponents who are attacking them as well. Dormant Grove, 4 to cast. It's an enchantment to start, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then if that creature has toughness 6 or greater, you flip it, or you transform it, and it turns into a Vigilance Tree Folk that's 3/6 that gives other creatures you control vigilance, which is actually nice to have extra keywords. So depending on what's going on in the game, you may want to flip this as fast as possible, or you may not want to, so you can distribute this stuff around so that it doesn't flip. So it depends on what is going on in the board state. Card draw time, Elemental Bond. It's 3 to cast, and whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. So in a deck that's based around +1/+1 counters, this could draw you a lot of cards because you already start off as 1/1s being 2/2s. So anything above a 1 power will most likely, with Renata out, be a 3 power. And Colossal Majesty is the last enchantment. It's also card draw. 3 to cast, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. So I tried to get as much card draw in here as possible so you can continue to keep putting creatures in play and put counters on them. As far as the artifacts go, it's very short. I have protection for Renata in Mirror Shield. It gives it +0/+2 and hexproof, and equips for 2. And then something with Death Touch that you can read later. I don't care about that. And then Ronus' Monument. So it's a 3 to cast legendary artifact that makes green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, which is always nice, especially for the creatures that cost X to cast. And then whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets a buff of +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. So short and sweet, but both are very useful for this deck. And the last card that I'll show you is the only Planeswalker in the deck. It's Jiang Yanggu Wildcrafter. It's 3 to cast, enters play with 3 loyalty counters. And it could have been in the ramp section, but I wanted to highlight it because it's actually a beast in this deck. It says each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has the ability to tap to add a mana of any one color, and then you can take a loyalty counter off of it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So if for some reason one of the creatures that doesn't come into play with counters or get counters, or not in play when something that doesn't have its own ability to put counters on comes into play, you can use Jiang Yanggu to put the counter on it. So beastly of a card. It can ramp your deck really quickly when you get it out. If you get it out with a bunch of creatures in play that don't have summoning sickness, it could be really, really useful, especially with all the card draw and being able to put things into play. It's really good.
And there you have it, folks. A Renata Call to the Hunt +1/+1 counters build on a $40 budget. I tested a similar build against Sparkio and Arena just to see how well this deck would gel, and I was surprised at not only how well the deck played, but also at how much fun it was. I found so many synergies that I didn't want to stop playing with it so I could find more. So if huge creatures that can just keep growing are your thing, then this is certainly a deck for you. Starting with my next video, I have a few budget 60 card builds that I want to show you. I've been brewing up some original ideas that worked well, so I decided to add them to my Battle Brew selection of precons that I make and sell. I believe you all will like what I've come up with, so be sure to join me for that starting next Friday. So until then, go check out my plethora of deck tech videos to tide you over. As always, thanks for watching, and if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or concerns, or you just want to talk or chat about any of the videos I put out, you can do so using any of the methods I have displayed here. Additionally, if you would like to support the channel, you can do so in 3 ways. Donations are accepted and greatly appreciated. I have 3 methods with which you can do so displayed on the screen, and keep in mind that no amount is too small. If donations aren't your thing, and you would like to get something for your money, that's great too. I sell a lot of the decks I present on the channel, as well as mystery packs. So if you're interested in any of these, you can contact me using the information I have up on your screen right now. Directly contacting me is usually the best and cheapest way to do so, but you can always look at what I currently have available on the Facebook Marketplace. And lastly, if you want to show your love and support for the channel, but like myself, are a little strapped for cash, it doesn't cost you anything to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, watch some videos and give them a like, and possibly share them out on your social medias you use to help spread my content to more people. No matter what way you choose is greatly appreciated and will help support the channel, and I thank you for it. Sadly, that is all the time I have for this video. Thank you for watching, and please, stick around and watch some of the many great videos I've posted over the last few years, and remember to check back again for new content I'll be posting every week. Have a great day.